few remarks about Sophiatown itself, what it was, and what it represents. It was a community that existed in the 1950s during apartheid South Africa that was one of the famous communities destroyed by the apartheid state. Destroyed because it was an area where black people were living within the city limits, and according to the apartheid ideology, black people were not supposed to, live in the city limits, okay, of Johannesburg. And there were similar destructions all over South Africa. So some people may be familiar with District 6 in Cape Town, which was another multiracial community that was destroyed by the apartheid government. So I want to think about, the way in which Sophiatown sort of remains etched in memory. And one of the things that I want to point out is that what distinguished Sophiatown from the rest of Johannesburg was that it was actually the only area in Johannesburg that was exempt from the Urban Areas Act. And so therefore it was the only place in Johannesburg during apartheid where black people could own property. And so while the majority of the residents in Sophiatown were poor and working class, there was a substantial sort of black middle class that owned property. You had black doctors, lawyers, in the community. And so as a sort of a site of memory, it sort of functions as a place that kind of reminds people of a sort of interracial people living side by side. There were whites, there were people of mixed race, there were Indians, there were blacks all living in this community. And so it sort of remains important for that reason, for kind of a past that, had a promise for kind of multiracialism, in a sense, what South Africa maybe could have been if the apartheid, laws were not instituted, if apartheid did not sort of get instituted in the way that it does. But I think it's also more important to realize that while it has this sort of symbol of being, so you have the symbol of wealthy, black South African families living next to poor black South African families, that this is as much representational as it is in actuality. Okay, in actuality, 80% of the houses were owned by whites. Many of the black people were, in fact, living in much more poor and cramped locations, and some of the sort of harmoniousness between races was in some ways sort of exaggerated, okay, for sort of remembrance effects. But what I want to get to is, what Sophiatown kind of means today. So when Sophiatown was bulldozed, and it was I think a several year process. So it wasn't like they just kind of came in and did it in one day. It was sort of slowly by surely the community was bulldozed. The apartheid regime renamed it Triumph, which is the Afrikaans word for triumph. So, I guess they're saying that they have triumphed over, this sort of space of blackness that was about, sort of kind of, a place where black people could exist in relative equality with people of other races. So what I want to think about is what makes it such a powerful symbol today? What aspects of Sophiatown are being recalled, and how are they being incorporated into contemporary popular culture? In 2006, the ANC-controlled government in the city of Johannesburg officially renamed Triumph back to Sophiatown. This was a culmination of a 10-year process that began in 1997 with a resolution to rename the suburb. The renaming ceremony included several dozen former residents of Sophiatown, including luminaries such as Adelaide Tambo and members of the Kuma family. And the Kuma family home is currently a historical landmark, and it was one of only 3 buildings to escape demolition. And it was honored with the heritage plaque during the ceremony. Residents marched to Christ the King Anglican Church, which was one of the other buildings not destroyed, made famous by anti-apartheid activist Father Trevor Huddleston, and laid a wreath to commemorate him. The joyous celebrations, however, remained tinged with the traumatic memory of removal. Irene Cow, one of the participants in the ceremony and a former resident, stated, quote, "The pain does not go away. Every time you come here, it is revived," unquote. A current council member in a nearby city who was born in Sophiatown expressed the frustration of walking through areas where his family once lived. Quote, I felt like knocking on the door of the house his parents once lived in and saying, my parents lived here. It's my parents' place. I want it back. But you can't do that, unquote. And I find that quote really interesting because if we know the history of Safari, we know all the houses were in fact destroyed. So literally, the actual literal physical house that his parents lived in cannot possibly still exist today. And yet he has this memory of saying that, he's going back to, his parents' house and trying to reclaim that. So I think that's an interesting thing to think about. Because, there were only 3 buildings that escaped, and he's not a Kuma, so it wasn't the Kuma family house that he was going back to. But it was sort of this memory of, going back to a home and, kind of staking claim to a space. The current, well, I don't know if he's currently the mayor still, but the current mayor of Johannesburg, Amos Masondo, spoke during a dedication ceremony about why Sophia Town remains etched in the memory of South Africans. He states, Sophia Town evokes memories of a vibrant, creative, multicultural community, a place where artists, writers, and musicians flourish against all odds in an atmosphere of racial tolerance. For the white establishment, the threat posed by Sophia Town was cultural as well as political. Sophia Town was a grand experiment in the management of cultural diversity. For Masondo, as well as many commentators of Sophia Town, the memory is not only an active episode of reconstruction, but is also a promise for a future that is racially diverse, tolerant, and prosperous. According to Masondo, Sophia Town is the past we dare not forget, as well as the future we must invest in. And so, this is what's kind of, important about this sort of imagination of Sophia Town. And so now I want to kind of get into, the ways it's been sort of put into use in post-apartheid South African culture. And Sophia Town sort of as a source of inspiration has probably had the most currency in both the fields of fashion and music. 2 major fashion labels, Stone Cherry, based out of Johannesburg, and Sun Goddess, based out of Cape Town, have made a name for themselves incorporating aspects of 1950s Sophia Town attire into their wardrobe. So I just wanted to show you a little bit of that. So this is Stone Cherry. So I'm just going to sort of click at some of the different pictures, and you can see how there's sort of this updating of an incorporation of a kind of 1950s style attire, but then sort of updating it for contemporary. And this is what they've sort of made their money off of, is sort of recapturing that. One of the most famous things that this particular designer did was to recreate images from Drum magazine of the 1950s onto t-shirts, dresses, and things, and then have people wear them. I was trying to find those images, but I guess since it was an old collection, she doesn't have them here on this website. So I just want to, show you a couple of the images so that you can see, particularly with this kind of attire, the way in which the 50s style sort of gets incorporated in fashion. And then Sun Goddess is another fashion label that's also, worked that, and it's kind of dark, but if you can kind of see the images. Okay. Okay, but I'm going to focus today on one Kwaito group, Mafiki Zolo, and how they sort of put the imagery of Sophia Town to use. Their use of Sophia Town and the totality of their musical practices, both through the dance, fashion, and sound, exhibits that far from being disconnected from history, that young Kwaito stars are quite cognizant of it. Their citation practices reference moments such as Sophia Town both as a site of critical remembrance and as a space for possibly configuring and reconfiguring the present and the future. Furthermore, these citation practices pay homage to previous generations of musical artists who often struggled to create music under much more trying circumstances than those that exist today. Therefore, I suggest that the genre of music known as Afropop is a critical and conscious engagement by Kwaito artists with South African history. And so this is sort of a quote kind of linking this sort of Afropop with Kwaito. At the end of the 1990s, we saw a rise of a Kwaito sound that incorporates traditional music, jazz, and church songs, with groups like Mafiki Zolo, Malaika, and